He's written for The Telegraph, The Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Spectator, City AM, Conservative Home, International Business Times, and CapEx, and has appeared on Sky News, Newsnight, BBC News, Bloomberg TV, CNBC, Scotland Tonight, and The Today Programme, as well as many others. Can't be many others. I think that's the entire media. He likes cooking and pop music and reviews restaurants at Straight Up London. He'll be talking today about neoliberalism. Please give him a clap as he comes to the stage.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I'm going to try and squeeze in quite a lot into a short space of time. I was once told to never speak in public for longer than you can last in bed. So in conclusion, I bristle at the term left libertarian. I am not a left libertarian. Although some of them are my best friends, I don't like left libertarianism. I don't believe in left libertarianism. And I believe that this conference or this event has been falsely labeled. And you're all victims of fraud, because I'm not going to be talking about that at all. I'm going to be talking about neoliberalism, which is partially a troll of people and partially by embracing a word that does not have a good reputation, but is also, I think, a valuable way of understanding a particular group of people. If you could ignore, by the way, the giant P on the thing, that's a typo. I didn't intend to include that, but what I'm going to do really is just give you a vague outline of this kind of philosophy that I think is similar in many ways to kind of mainstream libertarianism, but also differs in some ways as well. Before I do that, though, I want to bring your attention to something called the Long Depression, which was a period towards the end of the 19th century, the final 3 decades, during which the global economy changed dramatically. It's kind of mislabeled. It wasn't really a depression. Economic growth was slower then in most countries than it had been, but it was still positive. Unemployment wasn't especially high, except in certain areas, but it was a period of massive dislocation. It was a period of massive change, and one that I think actually shaped 20th century history in a very, very harmful way. The important point from the quote I've got up on the screen is the final line. The Depression affected some quite distinct social groups who became loud in complaint at the economic liberalism that had caused such troubles. So I want to give you a brief overview of this period. This was basically where the Industrial Revolution really started to change people's lives across the world. It began with the financial panic of 1873. Real interest rates began to fall and fell to historically very, very low levels. Previous people who had been able to exist solely on their savings by buying government bonds and living off the income from that were no longer able to do that. During this period, Europe's agrarian base was eroded, raw materials, food prices fell across the world relative to manufacturing prices, and there was massive migration into towns. The cause of this was mostly technological. There were huge technological advances during this period. Railways extended their way into countries like Russia, the US, Argentina. Shipping, because of steam shipping advances, shipping became much cheaper. You could have much smaller crews. You could do global shipping on much, much less coal. And because of this, the global grain market and the global food market opened up and became, for the first time, a global market. Imports from Russia, from the US, from Australia, from Argentina into Europe caused the price of food to fall dramatically. And that had the effect of putting many European farmers out of business, and it drove European farmers into the cities. They could no longer kind of live in the sort of agrarian life they had previously had. Their parents, their grandparents had lived on. Things changed dramatically. I've got some interesting statistics on the board there, but this was true not just of grain, but of food, refrigeration technology, dairy, coffee, any kind of raw material you really care to think of during this period fell dramatically in price. So the consequences of this were the great migrations into the cities, the huge urbanization, the likes of which the Western world really had never seen before. This led to independent artisans being priced out. Raw materials meant that factories could develop big economies of scale. Labor was extremely cheap because there was so much movement into cities. And this had the effect of creating, for the first time, a kind of an urban working class, an urban proletariat. After the tremendous downward pressure on prices, the tremendous cheapening of the price of food, there were calls for tariffs, and these calls were successful. The calls for tariffs meant that after this huge dislocation had taken place, after all these people had moved into the cities, the price of food began to rise. People's purchasing power began to fall, and so we had, for the first time again, this clamor for kind of socialism. Clamor for tariffs led to increase in the cost of living, which led to the growth of the trade union and labor movement. On the right, imperialism, nationalism, tariffs all became increasingly popular. And some of the kind of artisans, some of the manufacturers also used this as an opportunity to get tariffs as well. And the consequence, according to Norman Stone and some other historians, and I think it's probably accurate, was ultimately the death of classical liberalism. Caught between nationalism on the right and left-wing socialism on the left, classical liberalism really had nothing to offer. So what I want to ask is, during this era of massive technological progress, globalization, in the wake of a financial panic which caused huge economic dislocations and demand for protectionism and demand for nationalism, during which growth increased but people's economic security fell, does this remind you of anything? Does it ring any bells? I think the parallels with today are striking, and it's very, very useful, I think, to have this in mind when we think about the future, because we could be facing a repeat of the mistakes that were made in response to the Long Depression. We could be walking back and repeating the same errors that led to the worst, in terms of war and in terms of death, the worst century in global history, the 20th century. So with that in mind, I want to talk about neoliberalism. I'm not going to try and persuade you to be a neoliberal. I'm not going to try and tell you that it's better than whatever you believe, but I want to persuade you that it exists and that it's a useful term for a particular group of people who may be to some extent your allies and maybe to some extent not your allies. I'm going to briefly just talk about the principles, that kind of model of the world, the priorities that we have, what things matter to us most, and where the main issue on which we would disagree with libertarians about things. So I consider Milton Friedman, and he did actually use the term sometimes. He has a very interesting essay from the 1960s on the term neoliberalism. I consider Milton Friedman to be the classic neoliberal. Consequentialist, globalist, interested in the global poor, interested in the welfare of people at the bottom wherever they are, and most of all, interested in the poorest people in the world. Fans of migration, fans of property rights, fans of markets and trade, but fans of these things because they work. Fans of these things because they increase people's living standards, they give people more control over their own lives, and they allow more people to live the lives they want to live. Not because they guarantee rights, not because they have some kind of moral brilliance to them, just because they work. Neoliberals are very suspicious of politics. They're very, very suspicious of populism, very suspicious of any kind of appeal to the crowd, any kind of appeal to the masses overthrowing elites. This is something that makes us very nervous. And we're comfortable with political pragmatism and redistribution. And I think to summarize the view of a neoliberal, government's role is to facilitate as much wealth creation as possible and redistribute some of it. So with this in mind, the biggest priority for neoliberals right now, and with the events of the Long Depression in mind, the biggest priority is to defend the global neoliberal order, defend the trading order, defend the free flow of movement of people, of capital around the world. And the reason that this matters so much is that it seems as if the dislocations that this causes are having very, very unpleasant political effects. This is a graph of unemployment as it relates to vote for Marine Le Pen in the very recent French elections. It's obviously quite a clear correlation. This shows us the impact that trade, more trade with China, the so-called China shock, has on employment in the US. I think this is county-level data, showing that basically the more imports from China that go into a particular county, the more unemployment takes place in that county. This is something that we need to be aware of. This dislocation is something that took place in the 19th century, and it's something that leads to increased reliance on benefits. Interestingly, more so on things like medical benefits than on TAA, which is the actual US benefit designed to mitigate the trade impact, the kind of shocks that trade causes. More that seems to happen is people leaving the labor force altogether and counting themselves as being disabled. And we have the kind of classic, which I presume everybody's aware of, connection between the rise in Latino share of population and support for Trump. Note that it's not the level of Latino share of population, it's the rise, it's the change that seems to be a better predictor. But as liberals, as libertarians, as neoliberals, we know that the disruption is worth it. Trade is extremely good, and it's particularly good for the poor. Not just for the global poor. We know about China. We know how important property rights and trade have been for China, but also in the developed world. In the US, if we ended trade, it's the bottom 10% that would become the poorest. They would become the worst off because goods would become more expensive. And we know that, in fact, actually automation is also one of the really leading causes of this dislocation. It may not even be trade at all. So these disruptions are worth it, but they do have political costs. Paul Krugman actually has a very, very good line about this. Trying to stop trade to sort of undo the dislocations that happen is like a motorist who drives over a pedestrian and then to undo the damage reverses over him again to kind of stop things. Stopping trade will not help the poor, but we have to be aware of the impact that trade does have on them. We also think we need to maximize wealth creation by doing things like planning reform, making it easier to build, tax reform. Those are Jaffa cakes. Probably Kiwi or New Zealanders and Australians know what those are, but a lot of Americans don't. It's a very interesting court case about defining whether a Jaffa cake is a cake and hence VAT exempt or a biscuit and hence VAT liable, which was ended when the McVitie's brought in a giant Jaffa cake to show the jury this is indeed a cake. So it's very interesting stuff. But then the heresy that neoliberals believe in, and I think quite strongly believe in, is that redistribution is good. It's not just tolerable, it's not just a political thing that we need to accept, it is a good thing that we should support. Now, Will Wilkinson makes a weak version of this argument in his interesting point about Wagner's law, which is that government spending basically never seems to fall. This is government spending as a share of GDP in the UK. Since the war, it's sort of hovered around. It does move around. Obviously, we have the sort of Thatcher years where it declined a bit, but it's really only moving within the kind of 30% to 50% bound. We're never really getting back to this point here. But I don't think that's a very interesting argument, because saying that, it's not going to happen, that's not a very persuasive argument to libertarians. We know it's never going to happen. We know that everything we believe in is a very difficult thing to get. So I think 4 arguments for redistribution are that markets are very good at allocating wealth efficiently according to the most productive people, but nature is very cruel in who it makes productive and who it doesn't make productive. If you're a Hayekian like me, then you agree with Mike Munger's point that markets are very good because they allow people to show how much they want things. They allow people to express the intensity of their desire for a resource. But when people have very, very different amount of resources available to them, there is an inefficiency in the market there. Resources are not actually being allocated as efficiently as they could be. Pragmatically, I think people are less likely to oppose things like trade, wealth-enhancing reforms, if they think that their own personal economic situation is more secure. And rhetorically, having support for simple forms of redistribution, like a basic income or a negative income tax, allows us to oppose more effectively off-balance sheet redistribution, like minimum wage. Minimum wage is just a tool of redistribution. It's just a very, very crude one that tends to take from poor people and give to less poor people and create a lot of unemployment in the process. So to conclude, the kind of point, I've tried to give you a very brief overview, and you can read my article, I'm a Neoliberal, maybe you are too, if you'd like a slightly more detailed view. But to conclude, I think what should matter to people like us is the welfare of people at the bottom, both in our countries and globally. And I think right now the biggest priority is making sure that those people do not disrupt the wealth-creating and wealth-enhancing policies that we know work in the long term, just because of the dislocations that they cause in the short term. And the big challenge for people who believe in markets is to reconcile the short-term disruption with the long-term gains from trade and migration. And that, I think, is the greatest pressure facing us. And once we recognize that, then it will allow us to oppose people like Marine Le Pen and the sort of rising right-wing and left-wing populism in many countries in Europe more effectively. Thank you very much.